Hey guys, it's Sunny from RevAtlas and welcome back to yet another video, and today we'll be taking a look at the camera review of the Realme X7 Pro. And before we get this started, please do make sure to hit the subscribe button and also turn on notifications to avoid missing any videos from us in the future. Now let's begin. The Realme X7 Pro comes with a quad camera setup that comprises of a primary 64 megapixel camera, and this time around we get a Sony IMX686 sensor instead of the Samsung sensor that Realme has been using in the past. Now this is mated to an f1.8 aperture lens, and you also get an 8 megapixel ultra wide angle camera with 119 degree field of view, f2.25 aperture, as well as two 2 megapixel cameras, out of which one is a macro sensor and the other is a black and white portrait depth sensing camera. Let us start by talking about the images first, and you get great dynamic range on this and good definition as well. The overall focusing is also on point, and most of the time the object is already in focus when you want to click it, and the shutter is pretty quick. Now in terms of the colors, we actually quite preferred the way that Realme was going towards a more natural look with the X50 as well as the other smartphones that they released in 2020, at least in the first half of 2020. But of late I see that they're again going for a more saturated sort of palette, and that is visible here as well, where the images tend to look warmer and a bit more saturated than normal. In some rare instances, we also see slight purple tinting on the photos. But all this is fine, and the major area where I would like to talk about is basically in terms of the sharpness and detailing, where I actually expected to see a huge improvement compared to the previous Samsung sensors that Realme used. But in this particular case, while the sharpness and detailing look fine at a glance, but pixel peeping will actually reveal that the details are drowned out and there's an overall watercolor sort of effect happening here. Now, I would be fine if this was an issue with the sensor, but actually it's an issue with the processing that Realme is applying and the excessive noise reduction as well. Take these photos for example. One is shot in the 12 megapixel mode and the other is shot in the 64 megapixel mode, and despite having the same sensor, you can see huge difference in terms of the sharpness. Now generally I see on phones that the pixel bin images are the ones that have more detail, but in this case you can't even make out what's written on the board, while on the actual 64 megapixel image you can see is written tennis court. Now in order to understand why Realme has done this, you actually need to go and look at photos in low light conditions. When you look at the low light photos, what you immediately notice is that the images look extremely clean in terms of the noise levels, and this is because of the noise reduction that's being applied. Now I do understand that this needs to be done in low light scenarios, but it actually doesn't need to be this aggressive in daytime scenarios, and that's where Realme should bring a change. So what this means is that while you do lose out on detailing even in low light shots, just like the daytime mode, here it actually makes sense because you're actually getting a much cleaner looking image. Now you can also make use of the night mode in order to get better sharpness and detailing, but that will result in extra noise level, and this also does not make a huge difference compared to a regular mode in many scenarios, and you often see overexposed highlights for example even in night mode, which usually does not happen. Coming to the ultra wide angle camera, the overall image quality itself is pretty good, and there's also good consistency between the primary and ultra wide angle camera images. What's different is that sometimes you do see a slight greenish tint happening, and that's when the images do look slightly different, but then again it's not all that massive. The main issue I find with the ultra wide angle camera is that it's not very sharp, and the sharpness falls off even further when you proceed to the edges, and here you also notice quite a lot of distortion and aberrations happening. The ultra wide angle camera is barely usable in low light mode. There's very high level of noise, there's very little detail, and even using the night mode, the images don't look all that great. Coming to the portrait mode, this does very well in terms of the edge detection as well as the blurring when it does actually work. Now I mention this because there are times where it actually does not kick in and the portrait mode does not actually work because it keeps asking you to either move further or move closer to the subject. Now this is a simple software fix, and I think Realme will fix it because when it does work, it works very well, aside from the slight fact that here too, like the primary camera in regular mode, there is an issue with the overall watercolor sort of effect that comes on the subject or object in focus. The front-facing camera is a 32 megapixel camera with f2.45 aperture and a field of view of 80 degrees. Now this is housed within the display itself. It's a camera cutout on the upper left corner of the display. The selfie camera is actually pretty good, and I was quite surprised at the overall dynamic range that it was capable of doing. Even with lighting coming from the back, that is natural light or sunlight, it was still able to capture my face and the surroundings with good clarity and with good definition without actually blowing out the highlights or underexposing the shadows, for example. Now, where I do wish they would have done better is in terms of the overall noise levels, which actually seems a bit exaggerated, but it seems like here they took the approach where they actually give you better detailing and sharpness at the sake of higher levels of noise. In terms of portrait mode, the edge detection is not quite as good as the rear facing camera. Coming to the video capabilities, the Realme X7 Pro comes with a MediaTek Dimensity 1000 Plus chipset inside it, which is quite powerful, and as a result this supports a wide variety of resolution and frame rate. You can shoot up to 4K 60 FPS with EIS, and the resulting videos are also pretty good, although the stabilization is a bit wonky at times and has a slight jello sort of effect which just needs some fine tuning. Now in 1080p mode, the resolution is not all that great and the detailing and sharpness are not that great either, but considering that in this particular camera you actually get EIS even on the 4K modes, I would suggest using that over the 1080p modes. Now there is a slight difference in terms of the overall saturation, where the 4K mode is a bit more saturated than normal, but then again it's a worthy trade-off I feel in terms of the sharpness and detail that you're getting. Now funnily enough, the ultra wide angle camera shoots only in 1080p 30 FPS, which is fine, but it does not have EIS even in this particular mode, which I find to be quite weird. You also get an ultra steady mode in case you're jogging or planning to do run and gun sort of situations where you're shooting, and this does help out to cancel a lot of the shakes. In terms of slow motion, you can record up to 240 frames per second in 720p, and you also get a fairly decent time-lapse mode as well. The front-facing camera is not quite as impressive because it does not have EIS and it does not have a good dynamic range. Overall, the Realme X7 Pro is a decent performer when it comes to a camera, but not all that great either. What I really liked was the fact that this supports up to 4K 60 FPS in terms of EIS with good quality video output. It has very clean low light images with minimal noise. It has very good dynamic range. And if Realme does update and tweak the overall processing that they're doing in daytime photos with the primary camera, the results could get much better. But I feel that the ultra wide angle camera can't get much better, and this seems like a hardware issue more than software. Of course, I would love to be proven wrong, but I just find the overall output from this particular sensor is quite poor. And more than that, you also get a depth sensor and a 2 megapixel macro sensor, both of which again are not all that useful. If you're someone who is planning to get the X7 Pro because of its camera capabilities or planning to use it as a camera enthusiast, then I would suggest this is not worth it, and you could probably get a better smartphone at the same price in terms of camera capabilities. But if you're someone who wants it for the other features and camera is just part of the equation, then it probably is still worth it. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions, do let us know in the comment section below. See you again in the next one, and please don't forget to hit the subscribe button.